Hello, my name is Bryson, and today I'll be giving my formal report for the spring semester of 2022 for my BA105W class. Today I'll be talking about the differences and similarities of COVID-19 when compared to the Spanish flu of 1918, as well as give a personal reflection of my experience during the pandemic of COVID-19. And I'll also be talking about the list of criteria that are needed in order to be a successful online instructor. To start us off, I'll give a brief history of the Spanish flu. The Spanish flu lasted from 1918 to 1920 and consisted of 4 waves. It infected about 500 million people and roughly 1/3 of the world's population at that time, and resulted in the deaths of 50 million, including 675,000 Americans. Public news of the epidemic appeared in Madrid on the 22nd of May in 1918 in Madrid's ABC newspaper, hence it became known as the Spanish influenza. However, there is no definite evidence of origination, and most epidemiologists and virologists believe that the virus originated either in the USA or in France. To compare the two, similar to COVID, there was an impact on everyday life during the Spanish flu. As the influenza spread, basic services such as the postal service, telegraph services, and some banks were forced to temporarily close operations. Since neither an influenza vaccine nor antibiotics to treat associated secondary bacterial infections were available, worldwide containment efforts relied heavily on isolation and quarantine, similar to the current efforts against COVID-19. Vaccines were delayed during both of those pandemics. To contrast the two, the Spanish flu targeted those that were in the age range of 25 to 40 years old, whereas COVID-19 targeted and affected those mostly 65 or older, and especially those with pre-existing health conditions. The leading cause of death for those with the Spanish flu was secondary bacterial pneumonia, whereas COVID-19 deaths were mostly related to multi-organ failure and shutdown due to the overactive and overstimulated immune system. To give a personal reflection of my experience with COVID-19, I'm going to break it up into a few different categories. The first one being family dynamics. Without getting too in-depth into detail during this presentation, much of my family dynamic has changed exponentially over the past 2.5 to 3 years. My parents are now separated, my brother is going off to college next year, and we just sold my childhood home. With all of these changes happening and me living far away, the pandemic has made keeping up with family life rather difficult. Another part of the pandemic that affected my life specifically was me having to move to Fresno. Due to the changes in my family dynamic and much of their financial struggles that were happening before COVID-19, but were then heightened by COVID-19, I was told by my mom that it was unfortunate, but I had to move out. I grew up in Santa Rosa, California, and if you're familiar at all with what the rent is like in North Bay, California, it's very expensive. And I knew that I wasn't going to be able to support myself while living in an apartment or a house somewhere in Santa Rosa on my own, or even with roommates. So I had a friend whose sister had an open room in her house to rent in Fresno. It was about $605 a month. So I said, all right, I guess I'm moving to Fresno. So I transferred to Fresno State, and I've lived here since the 27th of December in 2020. Since moving to Fresno, I've hit many, many struggles along the way, and that's part of adulthood, but much of it is in relation to COVID-19. I struggled very hard financially within the first 6 months of me living in Fresno, partly to do with the fact that I'd never lived on my own before, but also to do with the fact that my hours at work were cut back severely due to a lack of sales at my stand, which was in correlation to the fact that people weren't going out as much because of the pandemic. I work at a coffee shop where we rely heavily on our regulars in order to keep tips and sales coming our way. And so when my hours got cut almost in half due to the lack of sales, lack of customers, and lack of people going out and spending money in general, that trickled down to my paycheck, and I was very stressed. I didn't know how I was going to be able to pay rent, and I struggled financially. I had to sign up for EBT benefits, and I also had to downsize where I live. I now live in student housing, and I pay a little bit cheaper rent, but that comes with its set of struggles as well. When it comes to my approach to education, COVID-19 has definitely changed the way that I view my education and the way that I approach it in certain contexts. I was in person when the pandemic hit, and when we transferred to online learning, it was clear that there was a complete divide between learning in person and learning online. When you're in person, you're able to see the face-to-face interactions of your peers, and you're able to have discourse that's organic. When you're online, especially in a virtual classroom where no one puts on their cameras or ever speaks, and you're just watching the same professor, lecturer, instructor, whoever, talk to themselves essentially for about an hour straight, you start to lose focus, motivation, and overall enjoyment of the class. The pandemic also affected my mental health heavily as well. Being a pandemic, part of that is being isolated. You have to quarantine, you have to stay away from the rest of society in order for it to get better. But in that process, you're isolating yourself from your everyday routines, from your normalcy, from what's familiar to you. And that caused a lot of mental health issues in itself. And as someone who's struggled with anxiety and depression since I was in middle school, the pandemic didn't help, nor did moving 200 miles away from my family, on top of the changes that are happening within my family dynamic as we speak. Overall, COVID-19 has affected almost every single aspect of my life, as it has for many others, and that's just one part of my personal reflection. To continue on, I want to talk about some certain criteria that I feel is necessary in order for instructors to be successful in a virtual context. I mentioned before, when you have classes that are online virtually and you're in a Zoom meeting and no one has their cameras on and no one has their microphones on and you're just watching one person speak to a group of boxes on a screen for an hour, you lose motivation and you lose interest pretty quickly. Here are some things that I feel that are necessary in order for virtual instructors to create inspiration and motivation for their students. The first and most important thing that I think needs to be there is structure and organization. It's really easy for things to get a little bit wishy-washy, a little bit too flexible at times when it comes to online learning. And while flexibility is important and it's good, it's also important to have structure and organization. That includes having a structured syllabi that is well thought out. It has a course calendar that students are able to follow along. And it's something that students can refer to for the rest of the semester, and they know where they have to be and they know where they're at. There's also a set of skills that instructors have to have in order to be strong and successful virtual instructors. And one of them is the technical skills. You have to be aware of how to use Zoom, how to use Canvas or Blackboard, how to use basic internet skills that affect the way that we use online learning. Sometimes things happen, they're out of our control, but it's important to be well versed in the different types of networks and applications that we're using when we're teaching our classes so that our students are able to get the most out of them as well. Communication skills are also incredibly important. If you're not communicating with students and you're not having weekly check-ins and you're not making sure that students know what they're learning, it's hard to know if they're really learning anything. By giving proactive feedback regularly to your students in a timely manner after assignments are submitted, instructors are able to make sure that students are getting the most out of their classes and adjust accordingly if they're not. It's also important to create a virtual classroom community within your virtual spaces because students are lacking that sense of interaction with their peers when you're in an online space. And like I said, when they don't have their cameras on in their Zoom meeting and we're not speaking and we're not having discourse, these people are essentially strangers. We don't know anything about them. We have no sense of personality or humanity to them. They're just blank boxes on a screen. So I think that it's important for instructors to make sure that students are being active in their community online and they're being active in the discourse, in the discussion of the class. And it's also important to teach with passion, teach with a purpose, teach as if you would love to be there if you were doing it for free. Teaching is important and education is important, and being able to educate your students in an effective way, especially in a virtual context, is super important, considering that COVID-19 has made a lot of people quite normalized to the idea of virtual instruction. And while most people prefer in-person learning, as I do myself, some people don't have the option to have in-person classes and they have to rely on virtual learning. And by following these steps, instructors are able to give the most to their students so students can get the most out of it. So to summarize, we compare and contrasted COVID-19 compared to the Spanish flu. I gave a personal reflection of my history and my experiences with COVID-19, and I talked about what it takes to be a successful virtual instructor. Thank you very much, and I appreciate your time. Thank you.